Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. Hammer all my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. Today we're going to discuss the failure, in particular on the part of the industrialized world, to confront the deadly effects of climate change and what our ethical response should be as the ecosystem careens towards ecocide. And with me to discuss this issue in New York City is Tim DeChristopher, who was bidder 70 in 2008 in Salt Lake City when he bid on parcels of mineral rights on public lands without actually having the money to extract those minerals, for which he was arrested and served 21 months in federal prison. He is the founder of Climate Disobedience Center. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
So give me your vision of where we're headed and what the world's going to look like, given the inability to respond on the part of the global elites. I think Hansen called the last climate conference in Paris a fraud.
Yeah, I mean, I've been calling the Paris conference an exercise in make-believe. We're certainly not stopping climate change at 1.5 C.
Right.
We've already committed to that. We're not stopping it at 2 C.
Well, don't we have like 4 or 5 degrees already in the oceans and the pipeline, even if we stopped all carbon emissions?
I mean, we have at least 2 C, which a lot of scientists are saying would put us past the tipping points where then we're on the road to 4 or 5 C. Which means that basically we're not limiting climate change to a level where we're still going to save our ice sheets. We're not limiting it to a level where we're still going to be able to protect our coastal cities. We're committed to massive disruptions in weather patterns and ecosystems and agricultural practices, massive dislocation of people. So I kind of look at it in terms of what the human impacts of that are that we can imagine. I think often we talk about the scientific impacts of this many meters of sea level rise, this degree of precipitation changes, but it's not just. I think we are sort of downplaying it by looking at climate change just in terms of like scientific impacts, because really climate change is a trigger on the social tensions and injustices that we already have. And so I look at like the southwest of the U.S., which is a region that I've spent a lot of time in, and have done a lot of work around the Colorado River system, which is already drying up and is predicted to continue drying up much more rapidly than expected. In the past year, the Department of Reclamation tripled their expected likelihood of Lake Mead going dry or going below the levels where it produces power by 2020.
Isn't this something we're seeing in every new climate change report, is that things are accelerating at a rate that climate scientists did not expect? Yeah.
Basically, every climate science report is more bad news, saying that things are worse and
getting worse far faster than we.
Yeah, and some of that is new understandings that are continually developing, and some of that is climate scientists just being more blunt about what they have known for a while, and sort of having stronger evidence to say with confidence what they've really known for 5 or 10 years. They've known since the mid-2000s that we're not stopping climate change, and it was clear when Copenhagen failed that we weren't going to limit it to a level that was less than catastrophic. But I think when we look at what that does to the human dynamics. Like there in the Southwest, as we're facing real water shortages, that's not happening in a vacuum. It's not happening in any sort of ideal society. That's happening in a society and a region of the country that already has social dynamics like the Minutemen and the Sovereign Citizens and all those groups that are in a habit of blaming their problems on people of color, on immigrants, and are at such levels of desperation that they're arming themselves as vigilantes, shooting immigrants coming across the border. And that's happening without any real insecurity that they're facing. I mean, it's just the sort of perceived insecurity of white men.
Although maybe economic insecurity.
Yeah, but a very slight level of economic insecurity compared to when Lake Mead stops producing power, when the mandatory restrictions kick in for the Colorado River Compact.
Which means what? Explain what that is.
So the Colorado River Compact is the federal and international agreement with Mexico of who gets water rights out of the Colorado River. And as the reservoir levels drop, it triggers mandatory restrictions. And so places like Arizona are the first to suffer restrictions on whether people can water their lawns. On actually the agricultural industry is first before golf courses.
Oh, we see that in California.
Yeah, first we're going to shut off to the farms, then we're going to shut off to the golf courses. But by that level where it stops producing power, it shuts off that, which means that the tourism industry there, the agricultural industry, are going to be suffering real serious impacts, plus the sort of just deep human insecurity of turning on the tap and not having water come out. There's something just unsettling about that on a deep level. And so if just the little bits of threats to patriarchy and white supremacy that are triggering these guys to go arm themselves and shoot immigrants, if that's what that little insecurity is causing, what is this actual major insecurity going to trigger in our society and in other societies around the world, as we're seeing in places like Syria right now?
Right.
And so,
which I think we should throw in is, of course, there's a horrendous civil war and saturation bombing on the part of primarily the United States and Russia, but there are also issues over water and resources in Syria.
Yeah, and even the CIA says that was really the main trigger that sets the Syrian civil war off, was several years of drought that forced farmers off of their land and caused a huge migration of several million people into the cities,
right,
which caused all kinds of social tension. Likewise in Darfur was a big factor in causing the genocide there. And so I think our role is to sort of step into that extremely tense and potentially hostile situation and try to bring humanity into that situation. Because I don't think it's inevitable that hardship pits people against one another and brings out the worst in us. I think it's also possible that hardship can be an awakening and get us to say, oh, maybe greed and competition weren't the best values to be basing our society off of, and get us to turn towards one another and start cooperating more. It could be, the genuine hardship of climate change could be a natural selection for those most willing to cooperate with one another, rather than a natural selection for those who are most willing to do the most horrific things to one another.
As the environment deteriorates, you could argue that it's only those who cooperate with one another who have a chance of building systems to survive. And Kropotkin writes about this, that the whole idea of survival of the fittest is wrong within the animal kingdom, that it's herds, that it's groups that look after each other that have the highest survival rates.
Well, I don't think it's inevitable either way. I think it is actually a social choice, and one that we need to be prepared for. That if we sort of stumble into that crisis with this sort of default scapegoating and violence that is rampant throughout our society, if we stumble into that, then we're looking at a very dark path. I think if we go in with a greater degree of consciousness and intention and courage, we can steer that path.
How do we build that consciousness, whereas even you had said earlier, we live in a hall of mirrors and an illusion. We fail to confront the reality of not only where we're headed, but even what's happening around us?
Well, I think it comes from those who do see that reality being willing to address it honestly, to talk about it honestly. Like a lot of people in the climate movement know that it's too late to stop climate change,
Right.
but say, oh, well, we can't really talk about that
Right.
publicly, we'll scare people into paralysis or whatever.
Right.
They say, oh, we can't talk about adaptation because that'll distract away from the efforts at mitigation. So like after...
You mean adaptation to climate change?
Right. So like after the Copenhagen failure of 2009, it became clear that we're going to see a degree of climate change that means places like Bangladesh are going to go underwater.
Right.
That was obvious after 2009.
Well, and I think isn't it pretty certain that most of our large coastal cities, Miami, are going to go underwater?
Yeah. But I think once that became clear that the place was going to go underwater, then the question became, what's going to become of the people, of the
Right.
160 million Bangladeshis, about half of whom live at less than 10 meters above sea level.
Right.
And we didn't have that conversation openly. We were told we weren't supposed to talk about that because people couldn't handle that conversation. But someone was having that conversation, because in the couple of years after the Copenhagen failure of 2009, India began building a border fence all the way around Bangladesh, a 1,790-mile partially electrified fence. So somebody made the decision that what we're going to do with those people is we're going to keep them right where they're at, so that they don't inconvenience the rest of us.
We know that the NSA, and they have run scenarios on climate change. The military and the Pentagon are certainly preparing for this world, yet, of course, they're preparing for it in secret.
Right. In the absence of a public conversation about how we navigate this difficult path in a way that honors our shared values and that holds on to our humanity, in the absence of that, the default path is genocidal. That's what happened that's what certainly has been happening with decisions about Bangladesh.
How do you cope with the kind of mania for hope that is particularly, or is particular to American culture? This, if you can't give a hopeful message, they don't want to hear it.
I wish I had a good answer to that. I struggle with that a lot.
If you, as you have just done, lay out what is a factual reality, and it doesn't lift us up to broad, sunlit futures, people will dismiss it within the culture.
I think some people will. Like after Paris, I had several weeks of depression, seeing the dishonest response by the climate movement. Mm-hmm. Even parts of the climate movement that I generally respect.
You mean in terms of calling it a breakthrough and?
Yeah, and calling it an unprecedented agreement when it's not actually any more ambitious or binding than the Rio Agreement in 1992, right. the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
And why do you think they did that? Do you have an idea? Because they must know. On a certain level, they must understand that.
I think it's a variety of factors. I think part of it is the NGO structure and the funding requirements of that, and what they have to do to protect their organizations and promote their organizations. I think part of it is a secular movement that doesn't really have any of the tools to grapple with hard truths.
Okay, but that's an important point I want to come back to, but go ahead.
Without the tools to grapple with that grief and despair that do come when you admit that truth. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to impose too many negative motivations on others.
But isn't it a kind of infantilism, really?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very strong belief. Like, a big part of the belief is people can't handle that truth. That, we need to spoon feed people what we think they can handle, and just try to manipulate people to take the kind of actions that we want them to take.
Let's talk about grief. I mean, I feel it. I read the climate change reports. I have children. It fills me with despair. How do we cope with it?
I think part of the way that we cope with it is admitting that we were always headed towards that path, that we were always going to die, and
As a species?
well, and as individuals as well.
Right.
We like to have this progressive notion that we do these good things to make a better world at some point in the future, and even if consciously it sort of falls short of a utopia or a promised land in the future, it's still sort of this outcome-based value system that's based on like things being okay in the end.
So it's the myth of progress.
Yeah, but I think that's also tied to a myth of immortality.
Yeah.
That when we talk about some of the most honorable things that we can do, we use language like we saved someone's life, but that person's still going to die.
Right.
And every person that we do something nice for is still going to die. So if it's really outcome oriented, we've always been kind of deceiving ourselves.
Well, that's why
value
Herman
system.
Melville, when he wrote Moby Dick, conceived of the deity as malevolent, and he sided with Ahab for precisely that reason. And Ahab goes in search of the white whale to slay a malevolent deity. Or as Marek Edelman, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, wrote, he said, became a doctor, he said, we shield the flame until it's blown out. How do we cope with that mortality, both as individuals and as a society? And of course, the ancient Greeks saw both individuals and societies operating in cycles of birth, maturation, decay, and death, and that none of us were immune from that. But we have a very different courtesy of the Hebraic and Christian notions of linear time, a very different kind of mindset that I think, as you correctly point out, makes it difficult for us to cope with mortality. How do we penetrate it, and what are the spiritual resources that allow us to confront what's real?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a process of grounding our values in the here and now, in recognizing that that our values and the justice that we fight for and all those sort of things make sense in the here and now, not necessarily based on some far off outcome. That we do these caring things for one another, and we care for the world around us, and we struggle for justice because that is the way to express our gratitude for the world that we love, and for the people that we love, and for a God that loves the world. that it's really the only way that we can be in integrity with the gifts of the world that we receive.
And not because things are going to get better.
Yeah. I don't think it has to be absolute on one way or the other, between sort of duty-bound or outcome-bound senses of morality. And I don't think that means that we sort of just act arbitrarily without any expectation of being effective. That certainly doesn't lead to good activism.
Well, I spoke with Father Daniel Berrigan once, and he said for him, faith was the belief that the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine in it, draws to it the good. And that it may be that all of the empirical evidence around you says otherwise, but it doesn't invalidate what you've done. The Buddhists call it karma, but I think that's kind of what you're getting at. Mm-hmm. And I think it's perhaps the greatest existential crisis of our time to see clearly what's before us and yet carry out the good, if we can call it that, anyway. Mm-hmm. And that defines the spiritual life. And I think that what makes it so potent is that it doesn't believe in an illusion. Mm-hmm. It accepts the darkness and yet responds to that darkness in just the ways that you pointed out, which is reaching out and caring for life.
Yeah, and I think that's the fundamental difference between like a faith-based activist,
which you are,
and a technocratic kind of activist.
I don't want to tar you with Harvard Divinity School, but you are. I also studied for my Master of Divinity, as you are, but I think that as the world unravels, I think we do have to reach, and it doesn't have to be obviously through the Christian religion or even from any religion, but there has to be a grounding spiritually to confront what's before us. And Camus had it, and all sorts of people who don't come out of religious traditions had it. They found another vocabulary by which to express it.
And I'm seeing a much greater hunger for that among activists, and particularly among young activists. With the other founders of the Climate Disobedience Center, we met with Rainforest Action Network a month or so ago in their offices, and we kind of were presenting about why we think our strategy can be effective for social change. Very much a logical presentation. And in our introductions, we had just sort of mentioned that we all approach this with a sort of spiritual perspective, and when it was opened up to questions, all they wanted to talk about was the spiritual grounding for our work and our religious perspectives. Well, we all come from slightly different places, and so we all sort of expressed what that meant for us and where it came from. When we started trusting that faith perspective had a real role to play in our work, and for me, it was a couple of years ago when I was advising a group of Greenpeace activists that had just done a banner drop and had been hit with major felony charges and were now facing 9.5 years in prison. And so I was basically sort of pastoring to them about not only how to prepare for the trial and organize around it, but also to prepare for prison. And then a few days later, I found out that one of those 8 activists, the day after I talked to them, had killed himself. And it made me it made me rethink what it meant to sort of help someone find the tools to do this work. That it made me recognize that in this work of climate justice, we are fighting some big evils.
Yeah, we're fighting forces of death, literally.
Yeah, in a lot of different ways. And this guy who had killed himself, he was also a veteran who had been in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's, the evil of fighting the fossil fuel industry is intertwined with the other social justice and other sort of evils in our militarized society. So it gave me a new degree of seriousness about what kind of rock we stand on when we stand up against that kind of evil, and how we're developing that in this movement. And I realized that we haven't put nearly enough effort into those spiritual struggles.
I think you're right. And I think that's the glue that will hold us together and allow us to go forward. That understanding that there are moral imperatives that override even effectiveness itself. And if we hold fast to those moral imperatives, or, the moral life, even if we fail, it doesn't invalidate what we've done, because that kind of fight for justice and resistance is not about what it achieves, but what it allows us to become as human beings. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for watching Days of Revolt.
Had to eat out the watermelon patch. And they put me in a shack